We're sitting there waiting for the show to start, and Jess is like, oh no, this is the show. So, awesome. Okay, thank you. How many of you are parents of teenagers? Okay, God bless you. We hereby give our condolences and hope to support you through the rest of your, until you're no longer fiscally responsible for your kids. We hope you make it that far. So, Christopher, right? Let's go on the next slide. My first question, why are we doing this? What is the deal with teenagers? Why are we having a whole afternoon devoted to this topic? It's just, what is it, like 8 years? 11 to 19, something like that. That's adolescence. Why are we spending so much time dealing with this short period of life? But what I want to tell you is this whole concept of adolescence is actually pretty new. Until we came up with this term adolescence, you were a kid and then you grew into an adult. There was nothing in between. This adolescent thing is a 20th century invention. In fact, in some cultures, next slide, it's still this way where you're a child or an adult. There's nothing in between. My people, so I'm Jewish, I mentioned this morning. My people, it's still this way. That's what a bar mitzvah is. When you turn 13, you have a big party, you recite the scriptures, and that's officially when you take your position as an adult male in the congregation. And I think of myself when I was 13, I wasn't ready to take responsibility for my underwear, let alone adult male responsibilities. But that's what a bar mitzvah is, or a bat mitzvah if you're a girl. You go from childhood to adulthood, nothing in between. And now you're ready to take on the world. Next slide. There's another culture, this is in the Amazon. They're called the Seder Amah culture, and they have a thing like a bar mitzvah, only it's a little different. What they do to initiate, so when you have a bar mitzvah, you have a party, and you get a pen and pencil set and some other gifts, you know, that's what happens. In the Seder Amah tribe, this is what they do on a boy's 13th birthday. There are these things called bullet ants, which are these huge stinging ants. So they gather up a bunch of those, and a bunch of them. They sedate them with smoke somehow so that these ants fall asleep. They then take these ants and sew them into these gloves. You see these gloves? Then they put the gloves on the hands of the boy, and then they let the ants wake up. Oh my goodness. Yeah, right? And if you can, I know, that is just mean, but if you can withstand it, that means you're ready to be a man. So you've gone, because you could withstand the sting of these bullet ants, you're now a man. So, you know, I hope they got pen and pencil sets too, because I don't know. So the term adolescence was actually born earlier in the last century when parents are like, what's this kid still doing here? It's taking him an awful long time to get through school. You know, it used to be when you turned into a young teen, then you got kicked out and you're on your own. But in the early 20th century, it's like these kids are sticking around longer and longer, going to school and such. So we have to come up with this name for it. And that's when adolescence was born, to refer to this intermediate time. Next slide. Now, if you look at, I have this chart that I made. Hope you can see it. This is the number of times the term adolescence appears in literature, like in novels and newspapers and stuff like that. If you look in the 1800s, it was unheard of. Then at the very beginning of the 1900s, you start seeing it more and more and more, and then it goes up into the 1990s and the 2000s. So this is a new thing, adolescence. You know, why did we come up with a separate term for them? So all that is new, but some things never change. Go to the next slide. I'm going to show you some quotes about adolescence that were written by some very important and influential people through the years, forever and ever. So I want you to listen to these and tell me if it does not sound like yourself or your parents talking about them. So this first guy says, I see no hope for the future of our people if they're dependent on frivolous youth of today. For certainly all youths are reckless beyond words. When I was young, we were taught to be discreet and respectful of elders, but the present youth are exceedingly wise and impatient of restraint. So that sounds like your dad probably talking, right? But now click it. That was Hesiod. He was a poet in 800 BC. So here's this dude in 800 BC saying the exact same things about teenagers that we say about them now. Let's look at another one. Click it again. The children now love luxury. They show disrespect for elders and love chatter in place of exercise. Children are now tyrants, not the servants of their households. They no longer rise when elders enter the room. They contradict their parents. They chatter before company, and they tyrannize their teachers. Who do you think said that? Click it again. That was Socrates. This is back in 470 BC. Teenagers in 470 BC were still like they are now, except instead of being addicted to chatter, they're addicted to YouTube and stuff like that. All right, do another one. The young people of today think of nothing but themselves. They have no reverence for their parents or old age. They're impatient of all restraint. They talk as if they alone know everything. And what passes for wisdom to us is foolishness in them. As for girls, they're foolish and immodest and unwomanly in speech, behavior, and dress. Who did that? Peter the Hermit. He was a hermit, professional hermit, I guess. This is in 1083 AD, not a whole lot long after Socrates. I mean, if he's going to talk that way about women, no wonder he was a hermit. But you see the point? Even though adolescence as a concept is new, in terms of what we complain about teenagers, been around since centuries before Christ even. But it's like, because of changing standards and because of the way media portray adolescence, it's like this become this self-fulfilling prophecy, right? It's like we expect teens are going to be disrespectful and they're going to sow their wild oats, and so it's become kind of this self-fulfilling prophecy. But it's also a biological change, right? From 12 to 20, so a lot goes on. Next slide, please. Here's adolescence in a nutshell. Every adolescent, basically, if you boil it down, has the same constellation of problems. Physical and sexual maturity without social or cognitive maturity. Many of us adult males are still in that position. The desire for independence without a clue of how to get along in life. Formation and choice of an individual identity. We'll talk about that in a minute. And the struggle to come up with your own perspective of right and wrong because you're convinced that your parents are no longer right. So I'm going to come up with my own ideas. So every adolescent goes through this. Why don't little kids go through this? How come we're not talking about with little kids? Because they can't yet. They're not cognitively or physically in the position when they can start questioning things, their own parents and decisions and so forth. So little kids are easy. They're totally dependent on us. They'll generally do what we say or eventually conform to our will. But something happens developmentally, psychologically, and physically that makes teens what they are. Teens, they become contentious. So before we talk about what to do about it, go to the next slide. We have to talk about normal development. So there's this dude have you heard of Jean Piaget? Yes, he was a Swiss psychologist back in the 1800s, or the 1930s, not the 1800s. He did some breakthrough work on cognitive development in kids. In fact, here's a fun fact, he used his own kid for most of his research, his own kid, Laurent. Now, our kids were raised by two psychologists, but they, I think, turned out fairly normal, so I don't know how this guy came out. So Jean Piaget studies kids' cognitive development and moral development. And one thing he found out is that kids move through development in stages. It's not this smooth thing, it's kind of this stop and start thing. One big thing they have to come to grips with is at some point they go from egocentrism, which is I'm totally the center of the universe, to sociocentrism, which are, oh, wait, I'm not the only person here, there are other people in the universe. But that transition takes time, right? It's not an overnight thing. Some of us are still not completely into the sociocentrism part, but it takes time. I always use the example, your kids are probably too young. Did anyone watch Rugrats when it was big time on Nickelodeon? Right. So remember Angelica? So she's the spoiled narcissistic kid, right? I'll never forget this episode where she's listening to some radio psychologist talk show, and, you know, he's taking in call-in complaints. So she calls and says, no one pays attention to me. My parents don't listen to me. My friends don't listen to me. What do I do? And the psychologist says on the other end of the phone, of course, it's got to be an old Jewish guy. So he says, darling, go look in a mirror. Go look, find a mirror and look at yourself. See that poison in the mirror? That is not the only poison in the world. And she went, oh, hangs up the phone immediately. So that takes time, going from egocentrism to sociocentrism. And again, it happens in stages. Now, this is a super important thing. Next slide. You have to keep in mind, this is super important as we think about expectations for our teens. We think our teens should be morally, you know, if they're old enough to sass back at us, that must mean they're old enough to make moral decisions, to see bigger godly and spiritual pictures, and to look at life from the perspective of others. But that's not what happens. So Piaget says there are these stages of development. The first one happens between, it's called the sensory motor stage. From birth to age 2, how do you learn? Well, you can't. You don't have language. You don't, you know, go to school. All kids in the sensory motor stage, all they have to do to teach them about the world is they have reflexes. They have neurological reflexes. So when they get hungry, they don't think, why, I'm hungry. What should I do about that? The reflex is their hurting stomach makes them cry. And someone sticks something in their mouth, a bottle or a breast. Then they learn, oh, wait a minute. Let me get this straight. So all I have to do is cry, and then I get fed. Totally awesome. I'm going to start doing this all the time. Or they, you know, they reflexively, they're flailing around. They put their hand on a hot radiator or something, and their reflexes make them react. And then they go, oh, okay, well, this teaches me something is dangerous. So in the sensory motor stage, the only thing you have to learn with is your nervous system. Then comes the pre-operational stage in ages 2 to 7. You know when a kid is in this stage because they develop symbolic play. That's the first time you see a kid take a shoebox and pretend it's a car, or, you know, do dress up and play cowboys and Indians or something like that. So they can be symbolic, but they still don't think logically, and they still can't put themselves in someone else's shoes. They can't understand the perspective of others. Therefore, as we teach, when we teach classes for younger kids, you can't moralize with them yet. You can't say to a preschooler, you know, you shouldn't take that child's toy because it violates the greater moral principle of respect for other people's space, and it violates the principles of God. That you can't do that with a preschooler. They're cognitively not there yet. They can't put themselves in the perspective of others. Then comes the concrete operational stage from 7 to 11. Now kids can sort of think logically, and they become less egocentric. They're starting to become sociocentric, but they still can't abstract. They can't think about things that aren't right there in front of their noses. They can't think about big global issues of starvation and poverty and, you know, how one nation affects another, because they can't, cognitively, they're not able. Then last, from age 11 until whenever, comes the formal operational stage. And only then do they have the cognitive ability to start, just begin to think about the big picture issues, things that haven't happened yet. Talk about things that they've had no prior experience. But it's not until then. And then, even then, it happens slowly after that. There's a lot of grown men who I don't think can think about the condition of others, and, you know. So it just amazes me when some parents of adolescents are surprised that they don't understand, you know, when they're trying to study the Bible with them and they don't seem to be getting something about big spiritual issue. They're cognitively, they may not be there yet. We can't expect them to be little C.S. Lewis's when they're still in adolescence, and this kind of thing is still developing. And it also surprises me when parents, when their adolescent comes home with some screwball idea, Our son, I'll throw our son under the bus. Now, he's now a big shot lawyer. He's an assistant district attorney. When he was a kid in this stage, he came home, and I respect him for this. His undergrad degree is in political science, and he said his thing was communism is the best system, and we should be communists in America. And it's like, let's talk about that, you little nutball. No, we didn't say that. But it's like, okay, it's a screwball idea maybe, but let's talk about it and figure out why. So we didn't reject him and put him out of the house or anything like that. This is a valid thing we need to talk about. But it's a little fringe, right? So you shouldn't be surprised when kids are starting to play with their new cognitive abilities, just like when they learn a new physical skill. So I think sometimes we expect more cognitively from our teens and morally, you know what I mean, than they are ready to handle. So that's why you still teach them through rewards and consequences. If you can't moralize with them and help them see the big moral picture, then you have to manipulate behaviors and consequences. All right, if you do this, this is going to happen. If you don't do this, this will happen to your good. If you do this, this will happen to your bad. That's kind of an extension of the sensory motor stage. And as we'll talk about in a minute, God taught his children that way. If you look through the whole Old Testament, we'll talk about specific scriptures, but it was God saying, look, Israelites, I'm just saying, if you do this, bad things are going to happen. If you do this, good things are going to happen. That's it. And God always made sure that that came true. He never well, let me give you a second chance. I mean, he did if they were repentant, but the whole Old Testament is like that. So sometimes I think with adolescents, we should think about a little more about that. Look, stop moralizing, stop asking them to see things the way you see it, but do control the things you can control in terms of rewards and consequences. We'll talk about that at the end. Next slide. There's another thing you got to keep in mind. This is super important. So as I mentioned, I'm big into the brain as a neuropsychologist. There's a part of your brain. So that's a brain you're looking at. Oh, it just disappeared. No, there it is. So most of your brain development happens between 0 and 5 years old. That's when most of the brain, physical development of the brain occurs. Much of the rest of the part of your life, so all the hardware is in place, the rest of your life is just loading in software, right? With one exception, the last 5% of development is devoted to this thing in the front called the frontal lobe. If you did surgery and did a craniotomy and opened the brain, you would see there's a blue part of your brain and a pink part. No, I'm kidding. The blue part is the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is the most, as human beings have by proportion, the biggest frontal lobes of any mammal. So we know the frontal lobes have something to do with what makes us human. And it does. It does a few things. One is, in the anterior cortex of the frontal lobe, right in front, right behind your eyeballs, you have inhibitory neurons, which help you control yourself, control your behaviors. Even though you have an impulse to do something, those inhibitory neurons will help you not act immediately on your impulses. That's why one of the theories of ADHD is it might have something to do with immaturity of the frontal lobes, because they are so impulsive. It also has excitatory neurons, which get you, when you need to, get revved up and excited and ready for action. They're right behind your eyeball, too. The frontal lobe also is your seat of executive functioning. That means all your ability to plan, to break things down into steps, to be goal-directed, all that stuff comes from the frontal lobe. That is the last part of the brain to develop, and it doesn't mature completely until the early 20s. So when we wonder, why are teens so impulsive, and how come they just do stuff without thinking, that's partly why we got to wait for their frontal lobes to develop. If they can't control themselves from within because of their immature frontal lobes, we must do more to control them from without, to keep them safe and from doing something stupid. So that's the cognitive and the physiological things about adolescence that makes adolescence so weird. But the biggest challenge, next slide, is the identity crisis. Erik Erikson, who is a great, founder of psychology, one of our heroes, said, identity is the sense of self that we achieve through examining and committing ourselves to the roles and pursuits that define an adult in our society. So during these adolescent years, you're acquiring an identity. And he defines identity by three things: your sexuality or gender role, your occupation, what you choose to do for life, and religious or political beliefs. Those three things comport to what your identity is going to be. Next slide. I know you can't read this. Erikson also said, I'm going to tell you the important part of this. Erikson also said that at every stage of development, there's a crisis. And you can't pass go, you can't collect $200 until you resolve each crisis at each stage, right? And that's what moral and characterological and emotional development is all about. The one in adolescence from 12 to 18 years is called identity versus role confusion. The crisis during that time, if you can't read it, teens need to develop a sense of self and personal identity. Success, the conclusion of this, resolution of this crisis, leads to an ability to stay true to yourself, while failure leads to role confusion and a weak sense of self. So this is what makes adolescence interesting. They're trying to establish their own identity. It's an identity crisis. I'm not going to move on to adulthood until I resolve these things. What's going to make me me in terms of sexuality, occupation, religious, and political beliefs? So they're scurrying around trying to establish this identity. And the ironic thing is, they know they don't want to be like you. You're their parents, and you're stuffy and restrictive and stodgy. So I know I don't want to be like my parents. I want to be different. In fact, I want to be unique. We encourage our adolescents to be unique. I want to be my own self. And you know how I'm going to do that? I'm going to find lots of other kids who are exactly like me, so I feel like I fit in. But we're going to be fringe. We're not going to be like everyone else. So that's why we have so many, teens where you look at them and you say, like, what is with that hair? Or what's going on with that clothing and the music you listen to and the stuff you watch on YouTube? When I was a teenager, I decided I was going to be a merchant marine. I was going to be a sailor. I was going to be an adventurous sailor. And I was going to pillage villages like pirates, and I'm going to drink rum all the time, and that was my goal as a teenager. So I grew mutton chops, like the sailors of old. And people would, my mother would look at me, she'd be embarrassed when we took family pictures, and she's like, what, you're not really going to do that. And I'm like, no, this is part of my identity. Now I look at those pictures and I'm like, what were you thinking? But it's this struggle to find an identity, and when kids try to group themselves with someone unique so that they can be unique too. That's why we have all these trends. So we're going to play a little game. The next slide, each of the next slides is a trend, an adolescent trend. You tell me what it is. So next slide. What's that? Goth, or what's the other? Emo. Is it still a thing? Okay, emo, goth. Yeah, still a thing. How about the next one? Nerd. Yeah, nerd. Represent. So nerds, we kind of never go away, always been there. What I tell poor nerds going through an identity crisis is, don't worry, that quarterback that just flushed your head down the toilet is going to be working for you someday, because you know more about technology. So yeah, nerds. Next one. Do we still call them that? Yeah, job. Yeah, that's what they are. Okay, how about the next one? What's this here? Yeah, how did you guess? Yeah. How did you guess? The fake tattoo on his belly tells it right there. I am not sure what this culture adheres to or what their beliefs are, but I know if you do that to your body, you're pretty weird, right? I don't know. How about the next one? Go ahead and say it. Say it.
Oh, you have them in Charleston, South Carolina, I am sure.
Thank you. Someone said it. I didn't say it. This here is your standard redneck, right here. This is the kind of person who the last thing you'll ever hear him say is, y'all watch me try this. That's the last words of a redneck. I'm going to try this. Not to, so we were telling, yeah, hold my beer. We were telling the Lisis that on the way here, in Florence, there's a Buc-ee's. Do you know what Buc-ee's is? Buc-ee's, that's what I think. I love Buc-ee's, but it is the distillation, the refinement of everything redneck. It's like all concentrated in one place. So it's like the coolest, most culturally interesting place in the world, and the logo is really cute. You know, he's got this optimistic, you know, chipmunk face. So that's what that is. How about the next one? Pothead, grunge. Don't we call him? He's got a bong. That's a bong. Yeah, burnout or stoner. Don't we call them stoners anymore? Stoner. So yeah, you got those, or white Rastas, whatever. How about the next one? The Glee generation, which, is there another name for them? The music choir kids? The what? Theater kids, okay. Which, if you go on to the next slide, truth be told, includes yours truly. If you look on the far left, this is me singing in my first, but by no means last, barbershop quartet in that was probably 1973, I would say, right? Right. Now, to our credit, two of those guys are now high-powered government lawyers. One of them is a billionaire, and then you got me. But yes, easily a billionaire. The funny thing is, this is hereditary because our eldest kid was show choir as well. And if you look at what she was wearing, it was the same thing. They had the vest, the cummerbund, the white pants. It was like, well, it's genetic, obviously. So yeah, that's a trend. Hopefully one that will die someday. I don't know. No, I'm kidding. Next, let's talk about a very confusing, bizarre, and very sensitive issue of identity. So next slide. Oh my goodness. We've been psychologists for 40 years, mainly child psychologists. We didn't know nothing about any of this until 15 years ago or so, when all this bloomed like an algae bloom all of a sudden, and we're being confronted with these differences in gender identity and gender attraction. So there's gender attraction, who you're attracted to, and gender identity, which is what gender, if any, you want to be like. I'm not even sure what most of these mean, but I can tell you, Mary and I constantly get calls from panicked disciples all over the place. And they're saying, my son or my daughter has come out as one of these things. What do I do? And sometimes it's an early adolescent or even late childhood, you know, way too early to be thinking about these things. So we end up seeing the kids most of the time, and I don't want to minimize this in any way, but we end up seeing the kid, and I'll say, you know, your mom says you've just come out as homosexual. Is this true? And they go, yeah, I'm a homosexual. And I says, well, you know, that means you have sex with someone of the same gender. Have you ever had sex with someone of the same gender? No. Have you ever had sex? No. Well, then you're not really homosexual. You're actually asexual. You don't. So a lot of times these kids are saying something that they heard or got encouraged to get into by social media without having a clue what it really means. So I'd say, you know, 80% of the time they're just saying this thing or doing this thing because it's what all the cool kids are doing, and they found other people who want to encourage them that are struggling for their own identity, and they're trying to enlist someone into that. Next slide. I'll read this to you. This got so confusing to me fairly recently, and where I work, we've got to be respectful of everyone, no matter what gender identity or attraction or whatever. So we've got to show respect and honor, which is right. But I really struggled to understand what all these different things are. So one of the therapists that works for me had a 14-year-old daughter. And she said, well, let me ask my daughter, because she's all into current culture. And I said, can you ask her to define all these terms for me? This is what she sent back. She said, and this is a 14-year-old girl. Okay, basically genderqueer and non-binary are the same thing. Not exclusively feminine or masculine, not exclusively a woman or a man. They fall out of the gender binary. Gender fluid, it's when your gender changes. I didn't know you could do that. They do not have a fixed gender. It's a dynamic mix of boy and girl or anything in between. There's something in between? I didn't know that. Demi-girl, they feel partially but not wholly female or feminine. Demi-boy, they feel partially but not wholly male or masculine. Bigender, their personal identity aligns with two genders. Agender, they don't even have any gender and typically use the they, them pronouns. Pansexual, and I thought, oh, now we're talking about attraction to kitchen implements. But she explained, no, it's when they have sexual and romantic attraction to all genders. Poly, that's when they have sexual and romantic attraction to more than two genders. Wait a minute, there are more than two genders? So for instance, they could find attraction towards people who are female, gender fluid, and bigender, but not be attracted to males. By this time, my head, my brains are leaking out my ears. Demisexual, only attracted to people once they've established a connection. Asexual, no sexual attraction. Aromantic, no romantic attraction. Gray sexual, very rarely have sexual attraction or only under certain circumstances. And then she says, I think that's the only ones I can think of. Well, thank goodness, because I'm having a really hard time wrapping my head around any of these. These are all new phenomenon, and once again, I don't want to diminish being concerned about them and treading that line between showing respect for your kid and unconditional love, but taking on these difficult. So we get these calls from panicked parents, and we usually say, look, don't freak out, be calm, don't go don't bash anything yet. It's most likely this child doesn't even know what he or she or they is talking about. I'm going to leave Mary to the big ethical part of this.
Like Michael said, this is not something to be minimized, and it's definitely families and individual kids are really suffering over these issues, but there's so much pressure these days to identify yourself in one of these categories, and kids hear about this very early on, much earlier than they need to hear about this. Go to the next slide. All right, these are scriptures from the Bible. You guys know them. I'm not going to read them to you. They're still in there, though, trust me, all right? So you need to go through and review those. But what I think sometimes what we want to do as Christians is we want to say, okay, this is what the Bible says, end of discussion, all right? And especially as Christian parents or Christian grandparents, we want to hide our head in the sand and pretend like this is not happening to our kids. And it is happening to our kids. There's a lot of pressure on our kids right now. So what I want to encourage you to do is to educate yourself beyond just the scriptures, all right? If you guys have not, you guys know about Guy Hammond's ministry, right? Right? He has a wealth of information online for parents, a wealth of information. If you haven't had a chance to go to his workshops, get to one of his workshops is what I would tell you. Yes, Strength and Weakness is his ministry. He is spearheading this in our churches right now. And he will give you a lot to think about in a weekend. So, educate yourself. Don't hide your head in the sand about this. There's also a great book called Homosexuality and the Christian, and it's by a guy named J. Yarhouse, Yarhouse. And honestly, I believe every Christian should read this book, because what it talks about in this book, he's a Christian counselor that deals with people that are having identity issues, gender identity issues. And what he talks about in the book is that what the world says to our kids especially is if you're having these feelings or you're dealing with this, you were born that way. That was set in you from birth, And what Yarhouse talks about is like anything else, how we live out our sexuality is a choice that we all make. We all make that at some point, no matter what kind of feelings or issues we have to work through, we all make a choice about how we're going to express our sexuality, right? When for some of us who became Christians late in life, we had to make a choice, am I going to keep doing the stuff I was doing before, or am I going to do something different, And that's what the world is not telling our kids. The world is kind of, the message of the world is if you're having any of these feelings or struggling with any of these things, then you were just born that way. That's just the way you are, And it doesn't give them the choice to decide, how am I going to be as a sexual person? So again, what I'm trying to encourage you to do is don't hide your head in the sand. Whether it's your kids or even if your kids never have any of these issues, to help other people who are going through this, do something to educate yourself in these areas.
And, going with this issue of it being a choice, if you listen to Guy Hammond, I don't know if he's ever spoken in front of you, but he relates his own story. That choice has been hard. He's a guy with same-sex attraction from the time he was very young and being mistreated sexually. Every day he has to make this choice. Now, he got married, he had kids, his wife passed away. He's recently been remarried. So his choice is a difficult one, but he makes it every day because that's his conviction. He developed his convictions from the Bible and said this, but it's like an alcoholic, Alcoholics have a genetic predisposition to being an alcoholic. There is a physical reason for them to be that way, but they decide when they become disciples that this is not going to rule me, and it's going to be hard. I'm going to have to go to meetings, and I'm going to have to get treatment and so forth. So very complex. Once again, we direct you to strength and weakness. He's got all kind of information for parents that's really good. So next slide. So let's recap for a second. Adolescence is difficult. That's my point. It's difficult. You don't have the cognitive tools to be grown up yet. You might have the physical strength, but you don't have the moral and cognitive strength to be a good adult. You still need a lot of guidance. Now, you lay on to that, normal adolescence, the fact that teenagers can have the same disorders that we talked about this morning. They just look different. They can still have mood disorders. They can still have anxiety disorders. It isn't just being a surly teen or a weak or anxious, mildly anxious teen. They can have the same biologically based disorders that we talked about all morning. And keep in mind, just like we talked about this morning, there are 4 components: biological, psychological, social, and spiritual. Now, your kids might buck against the spiritual part of it, but they are struggling to find even if they say they're not, they're struggling to find a spiritual identity. At the moment, it may be, I'm just going to do whatever my parents don't do, or the opposite of what my parents do at church, or whatever, but there is a spiritual need going on in there. Going back to why things look different, kids, for example, and teenagers. As I said this morning, when grown-ups have a major depressive episode, they become vegetative, no energy, no joy. They become lethargic. They cry all the time. They just want to sit there with their blanket over their head and sleep all day. Teenagers with mood disorders, it's just the opposite. They get contentious and irritable and anxious. So once again, it's good that we do an evaluation of a kid before we start treating them for something, because it looks totally different than it does in an adult. Bipolar disorder, little children get bipolar disorder, but it doesn't look like in an adult where you go through depressive episodes and then manic episodes. Kids with bipolar disorder have these discrete, and teenagers as well, have these discrete, off-the-chain, raging tantrums that are often triggered by nothing and appear to be for no reason and go like ballistic. And then as soon as it's over, and it's like it never happened. And you're picking up your, for broken furniture and trying to get yourself straight. And they're like, what's happened? So these disorders look different in teenagers than they do in adults. One particular thing we want to talk about going to mood disorders and anxiety disorders, next slide, is self-harm. This issue of self-harm. This is another thing Mary and I didn't see a lot of early in our careers, is suicidal self-harm, but also non-suicidal self-harm, which is what? It's the most popular one. Cutting, yeah, which that didn't exist when we started our training, and now it's all over the place. So let's look at, things can get really bad in a pretty short period of time. So when a kid makes a suicidal statement or engages in self-harm, you're quick to panic. So let's look at some statistics. So click it once. A 15-year study of ER visits confirmed a substantial increase, in cutting and attempted suicide, especially in girls. Self-harm amongst girls in the 10 to 14 age bracket tripled from 2009 to 2015, tripled from 110 to 318 ER visits per 10,000. That's a huge increase. Drug overdoses were the most common in girls and boys, followed by intentional cutting. So the most common ways for teenagers to commit suicide is overdose, followed by intentional cutting. Older teen girls had the highest rates, 633 visits per 100,000 in 2015, but the increase after 2008 was less steep. These data were considered an underestimate of the true rates of self-harm because it didn't include any self-injuries treated in doctors' offices or anywhere else that wasn't in a hospital, nor did they include unreported instances. So this is an epidemic thing, suicidal behavior and non-suicidal self-harm in teenagers. This is something we have to take seriously. So next slide. But there's a hierarchy of suicidal behaviors before you get totally panicky when you hear your teen say something. Oh, and Mary's supposed to be talking about this.
That's okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, we're just going to give you just a little primer in suicidal behaviors because in teens, things can get bad really quickly. That's the deal. The most severe is any kind of suicidal plan or suicidal behaviors, any kind of active suicidal behaviors. So, when we see a teen that's depressed and says, I've thought about hurting myself, we immediately say, how are you planning to do that? And if they're saying, oh, I've actually been stockpiling medication so that I can take medication, that's very serious, all right? They have a plan and they're starting to act on that plan. The next most severe is any kind of suicidal statements or any kind of homicidal statements. And sometimes we'll get calls from parents or schools, and they'll say, well, my kid said that they're thinking about suicide, but I think it's really manipulative. But the problem is you don't know. You don't know. Even for mental health professionals, this is very hard to assess. So don't just dismiss it as manipulative. Can it be manipulative? Absolutely. Can it be serious and you not know about it? Absolutely. So they need to be assessed by somebody first. Kind of the next one down is passive suicidal ideation, and Michael talked about this morning. It's things like, I wish I was never born, I wish I wouldn't wake up tomorrow morning, those kind of things. And then any kind of life-threatening behaviors, like driving too fast without your seatbelt on, or leaving the home and not telling anybody where you're going. Things that could potentially be life-threatening, and they're not worried about it. So that's kind of the ladder of how serious suicidal thoughts or statements are. But again, it's very hard to assess this. So what I would recommend is if your kids say or do anything like that concerns you, get them help. Have somebody else tell you, no, I don't think it's serious, I think it's manipulative, because it may not be. Just by research, the biggest predictor of suicidal behaviors is a history of any kind of suicidal ideation or behavior. So if you have a kid that has dealt with it in the past and is saying it again, that's more serious. Go on to the next slide. Here are some of the warning signs for any kind of suicidal or self-harm or severe depression, for that matter. A drop in grades from a kid that normally does okay in school. They go from A's to C's in a semester. Okay, that's a red flag. or a loss of interest in school in someone that's previously been interested in school, or a loss of interest in anything for that matter. You know, I had a teenage girl that had played on the basketball team at her high school and been very successful. And when we were assessing her for depression, and when I was talking to her, I said, "Are you playing basketball this year?" And she said, "No, I didn't join the team this year." And I said, "Why not?" And she said, "You know, I'm just not myself." And I thought, oh, that's huge. I mean, here's somebody that loved basketball that didn't join the basketball team. Okay, that's what depression looks like. Isolation from peers and family. You know, teens by nature are social creatures, all right? Now, they may spend more time in their room away from you, and I would encourage you not to allow that to happen all the time, but they're going to be talking to their friends, all right? The social interaction is huge during the teen years. And so if you have a teen that is not interacting with anyone, that's a red flag. That's a red flag for them. And then the loss of interest, which we've already talked about, in things that they previously loved, you know, that they are not interested in doing things that they really enjoy doing.
So once again, when in doubt, the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. So that's one of the things we look at as mental health professionals. It's much worse if they've tried something before or said something before. Now we take it more seriously. There are some other telltale things. You know, when a kid cuts him or herself manipulatively, they're not going to hide it, right? That would defeat the purpose. So they expose their wounds. When someone's serious about it, they don't want you to know about it because you'll stop them. So that's when they hide their wounds. But I used to wonder, you know, if you think about it, the human organism is totally genetically, molecularly, 100% geared to perpetuating the species, to reproduction, right? Everything in the human physiology is geared toward survival and perpetuation of the species and self-preservation. So I had to wonder, what would make someone, I can understand an adult who has a chronic pain syndrome or is dying of a fatal illness. I can get it why they would be suicidal, right? I just can't bear the pain anymore. Or if they've lost somebody, my spouse of 60 years has died, I can understand them wanting to end their life. But a teenager with life in front of them, and teenagers don't love pain, physical pain, what would make them think of cutting themselves? So next slide. So I did kind of a survey of my own patients and looked at some of the research. So first click. A lot of them, it's just social media, you know, it's what all the cool kids are doing. And they get on these, there's a bunch of, I've never looked at them, but I've been told about them by my teenage patients, that tell you how to commit suicide as a teenager and what good that would accomplish, you know, and it's their whole websites that tell them how to do it. So it's pushed by social media. Once again, kids that cut for those reasons don't usually hide their injuries. Next one. Just being manipulative. If you don't let me date this person, I'm going to kill myself. They don't want to kill themselves, so they will cut and show it to you, make sure you see it, so you know they're serious about it. So again, usually they'll expose injuries, but you can't take it for granted that they're manipulating. You still have to deal with it. You can't just say, oh, that's just, I'm not going to give in to that. They're talking about a harmful behavior. Next one. I've had deeply depressed patients tell me this: I just wanted to feel something. I've heard that a lot. They're so numbed by depression, they just want, or they want to feel a pain, a physical pain to match their emotional pain. I've heard that. When you hear statements like that, now it's really time to do something. How about the next one? This is a common one too. When they feel like they can influence nothing about their own lives, and this is true in abusive families. I didn't have control about anything except my own health. So I stopped eating, or I started cutting myself or injuring myself. So that's a pretty common one. How about the next one? Self-punishment. Some kids are just so self-deprecating and full of self-hatred that they want to punish themselves. So I've heard that. How about the next one? This one's weird, but it's true. They get this is another one perpetuated by social media that says you can get an endorphin rush by hurting yourself. So go figure, because it does release endogenous opiates. Next one. And establish, this one's interesting, they just want to establish an identity as a social deviant. Someone on the fringe, someone on the edge, willing to take their own lives and injure themselves, Why would you do that? Because they identify with famous people who have already done it or tried the same thing. So I'm going to show you some slides. You tell me who these people are who have histories of attempted suicide or self-harm, that when that became socially available, a lot of adolescents just went right after it. Who's that? Yeah, how'd you know that? Megan Fox, next one. Lindsay, next one. Angelina Jolie has a history, yeah. Next one. Amy Winehouse, yeah, who I believe is dead, right? Yeah. She was a successful suicide. How about the next one? To this day, Kurt Cobain. Like, I thought after the 80s, we wouldn't hear much anymore, but I still have patients who worship Kurt Cobain. Now, there are some differences. Here's an interesting thing. You would think the kids that committed suicide would be the socially disenfranchised, the losers, But next slide. There are differences in gender and personality of those who are more prone to suicidal behavior. 77.1% of self-harmers are girls, so it happens more in girls because they're braver. The girls who attempt are often popular, pretty, and seem to have it all together. They're more likely to harm as a form of self-punishment or to fit in, or following a celebrity example. So it's not the ugly, outcast, disillusioned girls, it's the cool kids. But then look at boys. Let's do the next one. 22.9% of self-harmers are boys, and they're usually the weirdos, the losers, and the lonely outsiders. Most often harm out of depression, for example, after a breakup, and they're more likely to harm by doing something really stupid like punching a wall than cutting themselves, doing something really, banging their head against a wall or something like that. So there are differences in not only gender differences, but, personality. So it's the cool girls that seem to have it all together, and it's the loser boys. Next one. What do we do about this? Fortunately, there's bunches of treatments even for adolescents. There's certain kinds of psychotherapy that are particularly good for suicidal thoughts and behaviors. Dialectic behavior therapy, that's DBT, and cognitive behavior therapy. DBT is best done in a group setting, which is good, because then teenagers find out I'm not the only one feeling this way. And, oh, wow, when I bounce it off of you, it does sound pretty stupid to be self-harmful. And CBT is, like I said this morning, teaching you how to change the thoughts that lead to your negative emotions. Then there's lots of medications, SSRIs. Now, you'll hear, when you hear a TV commercial for an SSRI, like Prozac, Paxil, or Zoloft, they say, may increase risk of suicide for people under 25. That is very, very rare. That's a black box warning. Very, very rarely does it increase suicidal thoughts or behaviors, but because it happened once in 1,000, by the rules of pharmacy, you have to put that in there. But I don't see that, I guess what I'm saying is don't let this restrict you from seeking treatment with medication when you hear that warning on TV. Atypical antipsychotics like aripiprazole, which is Abilify, and even naltrexone, which you use for heroin overdose. There's some research supporting that for acutely suicidal behavior. So before we go any further, any questions about that stuff we've talked about? That's a big earful. Because if not, let's go on. We're moving from mood disorders and serious things like suicidal self-harm to some behavior disorders. These are different. That's why we didn't include it this morning. These are child-specific teen and child disorders. They're endemic to teens. I'm sorry. Oh, yeah.
So the whole gender identity confusion, that topic, is that something that we should, as parents, be asking our children? Or is that something we let them bring up? I mean, is that something so our son is 13, so we're just,
So, like, if, you know, you don't want to make an issue where there isn't an issue, because that draws attention to it. And if you plant that seed, who knows where a teen's gonna go with it? If you said, so, have you ever felt attracted to another? Why, no, but I'm gonna look it up right now. So you don't wanna stir the pot until they bring it up, or if it becomes an issue. And even then, you don't wanna do it in a challenging way. You wanna do it in a help me understand way. You don't say, don't you do this, help me understand.
I mean, I would say there's so many, you can't turn on the television these days without there being an example of a same-sex couple, or, so I would say take those opportunities to talk to your kids even early about, do you know what that's about, and what do you think about that, and, you know, and then this is what God says about that, you know, and I would start that's a conversation that needs to start early, just like you would with any other issue of sexual purity or anything else. I would take those little windows, and there are tons of them right now. I mean, it's talked about all the time, to kind of ask your kids, do you know what they're talking about? Do you know what that's about? You know, a lot of our kids, you know, in elementary and primary school have classmates that have parents that are same-sex parents, you know. And I think if we don't talk to our kids, if we don't make that just a normal part of the conversation, we're not preparing them to deal with the world the way it is right now. So.
But the two things you can't do are panic and cease unconditional love. Those are the two biggest way to make this a bad thing. So you don't panic and say, no one in my house is gonna do that, you are out of here until I hear otherwise. If you panic or you're, you know, put on all the alarms, no, you don't wanna do that, that's the worst thing to drive them further into it. So you know, help me understand, do you understand exactly what this means? And don't ever withdraw. You know, some people will disown their kids for a lot less things than this. And it's the worst thing you can do, because then you're just validating what they're thinking. My parents don't understand me, and if I think any different than they do, they hate me, and they don't want me. So you're just gonna validate those thoughts. So you don't wanna be panicky, and you don't wanna withdraw your unconditional love. We'll love you if you turn into a green alien with a third arm. You know, we'll always love you, and we'll always support you. But we have to work through
When
this.
we do full parenting workshops, we talk about, you know, from this point on, it's all about the relationship. It's all about the relationship that you have with your child. You know, I have 3 grown children, you know, 31 is the youngest and 37 is my oldest. And my only influence, you know, I don't pay for anybody anymore, they don't live in my house anymore. My only influence is through my relationship with them. So you focus on the relationship, and that's what we tell parents. You know, we talk to parents who have had kids that have decided, you know, I'm going to be in a same-sex relationship, or I'm going to, you know, and we tell them maintain the relationship. You know, don't give up your standards as a Christian. They already know your standards as a Christian, but maintain the relationship with that child, because if you're going to have any influence in that situation at all, it's just because you love them and they love you. So.
And we've seen the best possible outcomes in some disciples' family with same-sex attraction and stuff like that. We've seen some very good outcomes because they're loved. They know they're loved when it all comes down to it, and they don't get that in the world. There was another.
Well, I was just going to say that just like I think that when I reflect back on it, that my parents were very naive when it came to the idea of just how much and how prevalent drugs were back in my day.
Right.
You know, I remember when my daughters came home from middle school and declared that they were pansexual. And I remember learning, you know, more about it at that time. I'm a school teacher. I've been a school teacher for 25 years. Just watching, you know, what the kids are talking about. It would be naive for, I think, any parent or anybody to assume that that's not something that's on it's being discussed by kids from elementary
Right.
through high school
Right.
all the time now.
Right.
All the time. So, you know, not to scare anybody, but, you know, it's good to know. Just, yes, that's a big point of discussion now, and something that every single child pretty much is thinking about at least a little bit. And so, you know, while I completely agree with you, don't pour fuel on the fire and say, like, have you ever had those thoughts, you know, but
know it's being talked about.
It's probably something to have a conversation, just,
Yeah.
with,
And you
what are
want,
the kids saying?
and you want them coming home and talking to you
Yeah.
about it.
Yeah.
That's the kind of environment you want to set up. What you don't want is, I would never talk to my mom and dad about this, but I'll get on social media and talk about it, or I'll get on YouTube and see what they say about it, or whatever, you know. So you want those things to be talked about with you. You know, when we do parenting workshops, we say over and over again, no taboo subjects with your kids. You know, you don't push it on them, but you make it clear, we want you talking to us about these things, yeah.
And also be wise, and we'll talk about this more in a minute, about you can't be naive about video games and what they're looking at on social media. And because I've had parents of violent and angry teens who, when I interview the teen, I say they like video games. I say, what video games do you play? Grand Theft Auto and Call of Duty. You know, those are their two favorite ones. And I'm like, does your mom know that you play that? And they say, no. And I talk to the parent, I say, do you know that they play this? No, because he's just up in his room playing these things. And I say, do you realize what the content is? No, I never heard of that. So I say, you have got to screen what they're playing and look at what they're looking up in their media. Now we get into the contentious issue of kids saying, that's my cell phone. You can't look into the history of my cell phone. And I'm like, oh, really? Let's look at this Verizon contract that says you pay $170 a month. Is that your signature on there? Did you pay the $500 to purchase this thing? There is no my until you're 18 and you're paying for this yourself. So there's no, you be respectful of your kid's privacy, but there really is no privacy when it's warranted to violate it. We'll talk about that more in a second. So in addition, as I was saying, to mood disorders and anxiety disorders, there are certain things that are endemic to kids that are very poorly understood. Like ADHD is it's not a behavior disorder, and it's not a bad kid disorder. It's a neurodevelopmental disorder. It has to do with neurological development. ADHD causes you to be impulsive, hyperactive, and inattentive, more so than it should be for your mental age. This is why a psychological evaluation is important for ADHD, because a million zillion things make kids inattentive, overactive, and impulsive. A million things. Not only bipolar disorder, but bad parenting and obnoxious kid syndrome and a bunch of things. And developmental issues. So we have to do an IQ test with every kid that we're working up for ADHD, because if they're 10 years old, but they only have the mental age of an 8-year-old, and they're showing the impulse control, hyperactivity, and attention of an 8-year-old, then that's appropriate for their mental age. And by definition, they can't be ADHD, and you probably shouldn't treat them with medication for it. So there's a lot of thought. Our ADHD evaluations take several visits and lots of hours, but you want to do all that first to make sure it's not any of this other stuff. Oppositional defiant disorder, which I've always had a problem with it being a disorder because it's not neurological and not neurochemical as far as we know. It's a pattern of behavior. It's a pattern of consistently defiant behavior. Irritability, moodiness, and argumentativeness. And once again, I don't know, there's no clear biological reason for it, but if you don't stop it, if you don't get control of it, by the time you get to be a later adolescent, you might develop a conduct disorder, which is all that stuff, the resistance and the defiance and the oppositional behaviors, plus violating the rights of other people, either by stealing, vandalizing, or being physically aggressive or destructive. If they get to that point of a conduct disorder and you still can't get hold of it, it moves on to a personality disorder in adulthood, antisocial personality that I talked about this morning. Now we're in really big trouble because this is an adult with all the rights of an adult to go do whatever he or she wants. So these are behavior disorders endemic to kids, and Mary's going to talk to you about some of the struggles they have.
One of the, with kids, let me talk about ADHD especially. With kids who have been diagnosed with ADHD, one of the things you have to work with as a parent is not allowing them to use that as an excuse for their behavior. I've had kids come in my office and I'll say, go sit down over there for a few minutes. well, I can, I have ADHD. And I go, yes, I know, I gave you that diagnosis, and I still ask you to go sit down there for a few minutes. I know it's hard for you, but I want you to try to do that. So we can't, as parents, we've had parents that especially when we give a diagnosis of ADHD, they feel bad that they ever punished their child for a behavior, that they ever gave any kind of punishment. And we're like, no, 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 they need more discipline because they can't discipline themselves. You don't stop doing any kind of discipline because they've been given this diagnosis. So the hard part of this as a parent, especially with teenagers, is sometimes you have to let them take their own consequences for their behavior, all right? I forgot to bring my homework for the 3rd time this week, and the teacher gave me an F because I forgot, but I have ADHD, Letting them take the consequence, the smaller consequence for that behavior is very important to them, because that's what they don't do, is they don't connect the behavior with what happens afterwards. Well, I didn't mean to do it, they'll say sometimes, I didn't mean to do it. And I say, yeah, but if I go out in the parking lot and I back into somebody's car, I didn't mean to do it, but I still have to pay for it. That's the world, So I would encourage you, if you have a child that has one of these disorders, don't try to save them from every consequence. That's one of the things that helps them. Let me just go on to the next slide. And we're going to talk about some final tips. And this is especially if you have a teen that's been diagnosed with any of these things, but just with teens in general, I think. You want to maintain as normal a family environment as possible in your home. Especially if you have a teen that's having some issues, don't let that become the focal point of your family, whatever the issue is. What they need more than anything else at this time. Michael talked about all the stress that our teens have to deal with in the world, and our kids in general. Your home should be a little haven from all that craziness out in the world. So you want to maintain a family environment where everyone is loved and everybody can relax and everybody has fun sometimes. Everybody in the family. So continue to do things like family meals. We don't have time. We do this when we do a full parenting workshop. But did you know there is research that says if you have meals together as a family, which is very rare these days, let me tell you guys, very rare for families to sit down together and have meals together, even several times a week, grades are higher, the kids' grades are higher, there is a decrease in drug and alcohol use, there is less juvenile delinquency in those kids just from the family getting together and having a family meal together. Because if you think about it, you sit there, you see each other eye to eye, you talk about what went on during the day. There's not all this stuff hidden going on in the home, just from having family meals together. Most families are not eating meals together these days. That's not a thing anymore. So things like taking vacations, doing fun things with your kids, which may be something that you have no interest in whatsoever. Our son in high school decided he was going to become a world-famous wrestler. Now, he had zero skill in wrestling, all right? But if there was a wrestling tournament, you better believe we were all there as a family watching him lose that wrestling match, So, you're going to end up doing some things you don't want to spend your Saturday doing, but this is super important for your kids. Birthdays, I'm a big believer in, I don't care how much trouble you're in or what your grades are, we're going to celebrate your birthday because you're a person and you're important, So I think there's, you know what I'm saying, though? It still needs to be, your family needs to be a nurturing place for your kids. Encourage your kids, not your teen, not to isolate themselves from family or from friends. I know this is another big trend right now is if you're a teenager, you go into your room, you come home, you go into your room, you get on video games as long as your parents will allow you to get on video games. You do social media. That is your social interaction as a teenager. Interacting with your friends, playing video games, and on social media is not the same as interacting with people face to face. Our kids are not learning the same skills. You know, you lay COVID on top of that, God help us, for 2 years, you know, and our kids have missed some social skills. I call them COVID kids, especially the little, like the 3-year-olds that don't know how to play with somebody on the playground. Those are COVID kids. You have to tell them, honey, go tell them your name and then ask if they want to swing with you. They missed 2 years. They don't know how to do that, you know. So encourage your teens to have a normal social life, if that makes sense. Get them into something they enjoy. You know, if they love Taekwondo, take them to Taekwondo. This is all stuff that costs money. It costs time. You're going to be sitting in the parking lot when you don't want to be sitting in the parking lot. Super important for our kids. Super important for our kids. The next one is encourage physical activity. You guys are sick of hearing us talk about physical activity this weekend, I'm sure. But just like it's super important for us to stay mentally healthy, it's super important for our kids to stay mentally healthy. You know, the first things I do when I see kids that I do diagnose as ADHD, one of the things I tell their parents is get them outside, get them active. You know, get them outside and get them active. There's all kinds of research indicating how important that is for our kids to stay physically active. All the things we talked about last night with the teens and college students goes throughout the lifespan. You know, if you're going to stay physically and mentally healthy, you have got to be active. So get your kids involved in something. I know there was one family, and the teen was particularly resistant to this. And so what they started doing is after dinner every night, they all got on their bikes and they rode around the neighborhood together. Now, he didn't love the idea, but he went. He went anyway. You know, so if that's what you have to do, that's what you have to do. Help your teen to identify their strengths and weaknesses even, but especially their strengths. You know, our kids, like Michael was talking about, they're going through these identity crises. And they don't know who they are, and they don't know what their worth is in the world. And if you think about it, the only feedback they get, typically, are grades or when they're in trouble, right? They get a lot of feedback when they do something wrong. They get a report card that tells them how they're doing in school. But nobody tells them, you know, honey, what I love about you is you're really compassionate towards people. You know, I notice how you take care of your little brother and sister. You know, that's such a great skill. Nobody tells them who they are as human beings, all right? And you, as parents, know who they are, what their strengths are as human beings. And they need to hear you say that to them because the world rates them on a scale of 8F, all right? So they may not know that being a compassionate person is actually may make you more successful in life later on than whether you got an A+ in geometry or whatever you're taking this semester. So help them see that. I know in our family, we would talk about, when our kids were growing up, we talked about our favorite sins as well. You know, because we all have them, right? Right? Y'all have them. Everybody has one. What is your favorite sin? What is the sin that you're most likely to fall into? And the thing is, if you know our kids, they told us what our favorite sins were too, and they were never wrong. They were not wrong, okay? But that was a topic of conversation in our house. You know, we had one kid that was deceitful. That was he. Oops. Oops. I should. Yeah, he's a lawyer. He's a very upright guy. But I mean, that, you know, and we talked to him about that, honey. That's going to get you in a lot of trouble. There's a lot of things. People aren't going to want to be around you. And, you know, there was one kid who was very manipulative. And she knew the word manipulative from the time she was about 3. She was smart and manipulative, you know, but she knew what it meant to manipulate people because she was really good at it. She came that way, you know. So I think that's fine. I mean, if you can think of some way, as you can tell in the Shapiro house, it was kind of funny. But we all knew what each other's favorite sins were. So help them know what their weak areas might be as well, you know, so that they can guard against those. And the last thing is whatever is going on with your teenager, don't give it up right now, all right? They are 13 or 14 or 15 or 16 or 17 years old. There's a lot of things that could still happen. Pray, maintain the relationship, And don't be in despair that this is the rest of their life. It's not. I've had a couple of parents our age that had kids that when their kids were teenagers, probably high school, college age, came out as bi something or homo something, or, they came out to their parents. And the parents kind of dealt with it. And now the kids are grown-ups, they're adults. And they're saying, I don't think that ever was really an issue for me. I don't think it was. I thought it was for a little while, but I don't think that's really ever been an issue for me. So don't, like Michael says, don't panic. This is not the time to panic because things change in the next few years.
And I'd add to that, try to enjoy, I know teens are teens, but they're actually really interesting people. If you can stop tearing your hair out over them, they're really interesting people. They're weird and quirky, but they're really fun to be with. What I see happening with parents, especially disciple parents, is the kids approaching 18, flying the coop, going to college or whatever, parents get panicky like, have I squished in enough education and moral teaching? So they like, instead of going out to breakfast together and having a fun time, they're like, I gotta make this either an interrogation, what have you been doing, what's your blah, 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 or a, you shouldn't do this and you should do that and get ready for this because you're gonna be, you can only do that so much and it's driving teens crazy. So try to enjoy your teen. Wait till the time they graduated high school. I would bring one every Friday morning. One of them and I went out to Waffle House. Sometimes it was just making fun of the people in Waffle House. We didn't have a moral agenda, or we didn't have a, sometimes it was just reading the menu and, so it's just a connection thing, like Mary said. Last topic we're going to talk about is what's on everyone's mind when it comes to teen is obedience. When we teach about young kids, the hot topic issue is corporal punishment, and we're happy to come back, give you a whole lecture on that, but you all got to admit, when you're a teenager, you're a little too old for that, right? So how do we ensure obedience? Well, the first thing is we have to teach kids about the concept of authority. As Christians, whose authority are we ultimately under? God's, right? Ultimately, we want them to submit to the same authority. Meanwhile, they have to know you're always under someone's authority. When you're a little kid, you're under the teacher's authority when you're in the classroom, loco parentis. When you become a grown-up and you're on your job, you're still got the authority of a boss. Even when you're not at work and you're not in your home, when you're out on the street, you're under the authority of the police when they come and pop you for a speed limit. So encouraging obedience to authority, sometimes we have to, I'm just going to say, tell parents they have to appeal to an authority. If a kid is being disobedient in the home to the point where someone's in danger or some criminal activity is going on, like kids dealing drugs out of your house or something like that, or their kids are getting aggressive and destructive to the point that people aren't safe. We have had parents, we've said, if you can't control your kids, we've got to appeal to a higher authority that can. And we've told parents, call the police on your teenager when he does that. We've actually told parents to do that. The point is, if you can't submit to us, you're gonna submit to somebody. We've urged kids to be sent to therapeutic outdoor programs and so forth, where authority is imposed 24/7. If you don't obey the rules, you don't eat. If you don't obey the rules and contribute, you don't have a place to sleep at night. So the whole point is submission to authority, which brings me to my next question. Why are teens by nature disobedient? Well, usually it's not by nature. It's usually the standards and the examples we set as parents. So problem one is when there are no standards in the home, biblical or otherwise, if parents fail, and that's surprisingly common, even in some disciples' homes. Or the next one, they hold them to a standard that varies from one instance to another, from one day to another. depending on the circumstances or on your mood at any given moment. You know, you might be grouchy today and you're harder on your teenager. The next day you had a good day at work, so you're not as grouchy, so you let them get away with this or that. So varying standards is not good. That's why Christian parents generally do better at this, because they know what they have a biblical standard to follow, and they adhere to it. That's why they became Christians. So at least you have a better, you know, you can say, when a teen asks you, why do I have to do that? You can say, it's not me, it's God. Let's read it right here about what it says about sexual immorality and mistreating your body and so forth. I didn't make the rules, we're just trying to obey God. So in that respect, Christians have a better prognosis with obedience in their kids because they keep to a standard. Lastly, though, some parents make themselves a bad example of submission to authority. They show contempt for laws, especially traffic laws. Not that I would do anything like that. I'm just saying that's an example, right? What I really hate, that this is something you've all seen and we can do something about, it really riles me at sports events. When a kid gets a call, a bad call, and the parent, in front of everybody, in front of the coach, in front of the whole audience and everyone, goes to argue the case on behalf of the kid. Yes, that might have been an incorrect call, but what are you teaching the kid when you storm down from the stands and you get in the face of that coach or umpire or referee? What are you teaching them about submitting to authority, in addition to making yourself look like an idiot, and in addition to the fact that this is not a life make-or-break situation, having a bad call against you in a baseball game? Yeah. The experience I have, I'm a 30-something-year veteran of Taekwondo, and I would officiate tournaments. And when you do Taekwondo, the tournaments, you have 3 judges that are right there in the ring. When there's a call, you take a vote. It's by consensus. So, and it's done really quickly. If someone gets a kick, we stop the match, and judges call for points. And the judges, if it's not the majority of judges, they don't get the point. It's about the most fair thing I can think of. But I've had parents come down, step into my ring to contest a call. You coming into my house? So I'm like, no, you're missing a teaching opportunity. So if you want your kids to obey, you obey yourself, earthly authority. God gives us the best example of what you do with disobedient children. So next slide. On your own, now in longer parenting workshops, I read these because they're very impactful. Leviticus 26 is the best chapter where God does this. Look, people, if you do this, you're going to get all these blessings. If you do this and you're disobedient, you're going to get all these disasters. And some of them are pretty severe. You're going to end up eating your own children, which actually happened. You know, if you remember, I think that's in Kings. So if you read these scriptures, you'll see God does take steps. The first thing he does is assert his authority. So in this chapter, about 20 times, God says, I am the Lord your God. I'm in authority here. I'm in authority. We should make that clear to our kids who run this household, right? Even though you're a big 17-year-old now and you think you're so hotshot and everything, you're still living under my roof. If you can't conform to my rules under this roof, now you negotiate and you allow them to have as much freedom as possible until they violate that freedom, and then you got to pull it back in. We tell parents it's like a tug of war. You want to let go of that rope. When the kid turns 18, you want to let it go. But when they violate your trust, you got to pull it in. If they violate your trust again, you got to pull it in. So we've seen too many parents abdicate their authority these days in the interest of being, I don't know, open-minded parents. They don't assert their authority. Whose signature is it on this Verizon contract? Is there really privacy in this house? When you pay the mortgage, there can be, but right now I reserve the right to go into your room, which is really my room, to look for stuff under your bed if I need to. So God did this. He asserts his authority. He gave his kids rules. He made it very clear. He didn't make any vague rules. which is something we do sometimes when we say, you know, well, you need to be respectful. What does that mean? You have to sit down with your child and say, this means no calling names to me or anyone else. This means no, this look on your face or the indignant stamping of your feet, that's disrespectful behavior. Now, you might tolerate that in your home, but if not, you got to make it clear that I don't. Offer rewards and consequences as God did. You know, and here's something that parents do that they need to tighten up on when it comes to rewards and consequences. They'll take something away. Actually, this is on the next slide, now that I think about it, so we'll get to that in a second. No, go back. Then, this is the most important thing, if you read Leviticus. He sets all this stuff up, and in the end, he says, now, it's up to you. I can't interfere with your free will. I won't interfere with your free will, because I'm God, and I love you, and I want you to have free will. But it's your free will to mess up or to do right. That's what God did. So we can't control, you see what I'm saying? Like God, we're not going to control. We don't want little automatons who mindlessly just obey. We want them to do it out of their own conviction. So we're going to give them free will and the opportunity to make some mistakes. So once again, read this chapter. It's the best, if you think about it, example of parenting, of any parenting book that I can think of. Okay, now go to the almost last slide.
This sets us up to talk about some of the research on parenting styles. And whenever we talk about discipline, you have to talk about discipline within the context of the parent-child relationship. So you can't talk about, for instance, we'll throw out the spanking thing. You can't talk about whether spanking is good or not good if you take it out of the context of the parent-child relationship. You know, it depends on what the strength of the relationship is as to whether a discipline style is beneficial or not beneficial. Does that make sense? So that we need to talk about some parenting styles. And this is, developmental psychologists have looked at different parenting styles and what the consequences are for the kids. The first is what's called an uninvolved parent, and these are parents that are not warm towards their children, and they put very few limits on their children. And hopefully no Christian parent would fall into this category, but let me tell you, lots of parents in the world do fall into this category. You know, they don't show a lot of affection and love towards their kids, and they pretty much let their kids do whatever they want. That's pretty much the way they set up their families. The next is what's called permissive parents. And permissive parents are very warm, but they're very indulgent and passive in their parenting. And they believe that the way that they demonstrate their love to their kids is to let them do whatever they want to again. This is kind of what I call new age parenting. You know, I love you, darling, you know, but there's no consequences for any kind of inappropriate behavior. There's no limits to their behavior. Kids are not equipped to deal with this. They're not old enough. You know, your 5-year-old is not old enough to know what appropriate and inappropriate behavior is, you know. So you're not being, and we talk about this too, your kids don't need a best buddy, all right? They need a best buddy at school, or they need a best buddy on the playground or in ballet class. They need a best buddy. They're going to have lots of best buddies, hopefully. What they need is a mom and a dad. You know, so again, like Michael said, don't abdicate your God-given role in your child's life. They get one mom and one dad. It's a very important role that nobody else can fill. The next is authoritarian parents, and these parents are highly controlling and display little warmth towards their child. They're strict disciplinarians and use a restrictive, punitive style. And if we're not careful as Christian parents, I think we can fall into this. You know, we can focus so much on I'm going to follow God's rules in my house, and you, by golly, are going to follow God's rules in my house, that we can fall into this authoritarian parenting if we're not careful. Does that make sense? And we forget to tell our kids, I love you no matter what, honey, all right? These are the rules, but I love you anyway, all right? And yes, they're going to get a consequence, but I still love you, all right? The last one is authoritative parenting. And authoritative parents are warm but firm. They encourage their children and adolescents to be appropriately independent while maintaining limits and controls on their actions. And as their kids get more mature and older, especially middle school, high school level, they allow discussions in their homes about what the rules and limits are, and they allow their kids to express opinions. What do you think your bedtime needs to be? Well, I don't agree with that. I think maybe 10:30 is a little late for third graders, I think maybe that's a little bit late because you have to get on the bus at 6, so, But I want to hear your opinion. So you encourage that with your child, but you let them know ultimately we're going to make the decision. Daddy and I are going to make the decision ultimately as to when bedtime is. But we want to hear what your thoughts are, and more so as they get older and more responsible. Developmental psychologists overwhelmingly endorse the authoritative styles of parenting, especially for adolescents. Authoritative parenting is associated with a positive relationship between the parent and the child and appropriate self-reliance and autonomy in the teen. So they're more able to take over their responsibility for their own decisions and lives and limits as they get older. And the other thing they found out is authoritative parents are more flexible in their use of how they allow kids to engage in activities with peers. For instance, if you're going to go with some kids from church that I know and trust, and you want to go see a movie on Saturday night, that's great, But if you're talking about going and hanging out at the mall with some of the kids from school that I don't know, that's not going to be allowed. Does that make sense? So, you're more flexible in what you allow them to do and not allow them to do, depending on the situation.
All right, now, next slide. If you've done all this stuff we've talked about all day right, you still might end up with a teen that's rebellious and disobedient. Isaiah 1:2, God, this happened to God. For the Lord has spoken. I reared children and brought them up, but they've rebelled against me. At some point, it's up to your kids to make the decision to do right or do wrong. Your responsibility is to teach them, but then you can't control everything they do, especially after they fly the coop. So a kid may still go asocial or antisocial when they leave your... Now, what you can't do is feel guilty. We have too many self-deprecating disciple parents who want to turn it all on them because that's easy. If I say it was all my fault because I was too this or that, or I was a bad parent, then it puts no responsibility on the kid for his or her own behavior, and it's a little easier to accept. So it still may happen, is what I'm saying. But as much of it is in your power, what do you do to ensure obedience? You do what God did, rewards, you set up rewards and consequences. And you be persistent. Too many parents say, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to take this away, but they don't stick to it. Well, that doesn't seem to be working. So now I'm going to do this and take this away. Well, that doesn't seem to be working. Okay, now I'm going to try this. What happens? What are you teaching your kid? That if they act like it doesn't matter to them, you'll move on to something else and finally give up. So I don't care if they act like they dislike it or not, you're still going to do it and you're going to be persistent and you're going to stick with it, which is exactly what God did. Now, incidentally, next slide. By the way, to ensure, since punishment of teens usually now constitutes taking something away, since we can't spank them or yell at them or anything like that, what do we have the power to take away from our teens? Because some of them will act like, I don't care what, nothing's that important to me. What'd you say? No, I just fine. Okay, so let's look at media. You control the media. You control the devices. I actually had a parent of a teen not long ago who said, because their son they collected all the devices at night and said, it's all being charged in our bedroom. That way we keep it to us, because the kid was staying up till 1 in the morning doing YouTube or something. The kid, in the middle of the night, was sneaking up, going under their bedposts to the dresser and stealing it quietly and coming back out. You know what that parent did? She shut the circuit breaker off at night, and every night after 10, yeah, that means she and her husband didn't get to watch TV and stuff, but this had to be done. Shut the circuit breaker off and put a lock on the circuit box. And I'm like, I totally respect that. That's genius right there, and that took care of the problem. So you take the media away one way or another. Now, here's the problem people get into. They take it away for they take it away for too long of a time, and then they add punishment. So they'll say, you just lost your tablet for 2 weeks. So the problem with that is, if anything screws up in that 2 weeks, then what are you going to do? Then they've lost any incentive to be good. So what do? You say, oh yeah, well, you just lost it for another 2 weeks, and then another 2 weeks, and another. By that, it makes no sense to the teen, take it away. You ever see The Breakfast Club?
That's what I was just
Yeah, right? There's this one scene. Yeah. There's this one episode where, who plays that character?
Bender.
Yeah, who plays Bender?
Yeah.
Judd Nelson is in this argument with the principal, and he says, well, you just got detention next week, and the next week, and the rest of your born days, and it's meaningless to Bender. Yeah, you mess with the bull, you get the horns. Yeah. So you have to be careful how you restrict this media. Next one. Now, I should probably take this one off, because something has happened since my generation until now. When I was a teen, this was driving your license was the sword of freedom. It was the excelsior of freedom. You did everything, your whole life was focused on getting that license. Nowadays, kids don't seem that interested. I'm amazed that these 18-year-olds are like, aren't you interested in getting your license? No, I just Zoom my friends, or I'm like, wow, this is totally weird. Because in my day, this was what you went for. Now I'm not sure what, so I should probably take this off. Next one, contact with friends, which I know we just said help them be social and stuff like that. But if their friends are being a bad influence and they need to be away from those friends for some time, this may be a good thing to take away. Next one, food, water, shelter, clothing, air. The point is, yeah, fresh air. The point is, you have authority in your home. There's a sign I saw once, I have it in another workshop thing, on Alcatraz, something like, air and food are granted to you, everything else is a privilege. It was on the front of Alcatraz. The point is, we got to have the courage to understand that we bear the authority over our teenager. We can take stuff away. It's not theirs. None of it is theirs until they earn it. And in therapy, when we're with families, we do this a lot. Often, when kids are at loggerheads with their parents, I'll sit down with the kid and I'll say, all right, what is it? You're head to head with your parents all the time. What do you want? What's going to make this better? And the kid says, if they leave me alone. And I say, oh, so you just want them to leave you alone? Yeah, I want them to let me do what I want to do. I'm 17. I should be able to do whatever I want to do. And I'm like, so let me get this straight. If they would leave you alone and let you do whatever, you'd be okay. Yeah. And then I'm like, do you owe anything in return for this freedom you so seek? And they say, no, I don't owe them anything. I take out a pad and I say, well, let's do a survey here. Can't help but notice you're not naked today. You're actually wearing clothing. Did you buy these clothes, in particular those $300 Nike, whatever they are? No. So your parents buy you clothing, really. You seem to be in pretty good health. Like, is this because you purchased health insurance and pay for your own doctors? Oh, so they give you doctor's visits, they pay attention. You seem pretty well nourished. When was the last time you cooked a meal? So I end up making this long list of things that parents take for granted that they do for their kids. And I show the kid this pad and I say, come on, this is what your parents do for you. You owe them nothing in return and want them to leave you alone. They go, okay. So usually that's a breaking point. If not, we've got some trouble. But the point is, you do things for your kids and you have authority over them, and you can't, God wasn't afraid to use it, so you shouldn't be either. All right, almost last slide. Next one. Last advice about obedience, make your terms absolutely clear. You can't say, I'm taking away your cell phone until you decide to be good. What does that mean? Or until you decide to, what we hate is the vague kind of Christian things, until you have a happy heart. What does that mean? You have to give them clear objectives. Until your grade point average reaches a 3.5, or whatever you think is fair, given your kids' abilities, then you'll get it back. Or until you start cleaning your room every week for at least a month, make it very clear, or else your kids are going to turn into little lawyers. Well, you said, or, yeah, I guess I did say that, and I was pretty vague. So make your terms clear. Next one, deprive for a limited time, but it clearly defined, like I said. So you can't do you lost it for a week, now for another week. So we usually, with younger kids, we say you take things away for a day. With adolescents, you can maybe go a week. But if you make it longer than that and they screw up, they have no incentive to continue to be good. So don't make these long, breakfast club periods of time. And lastly, stick to it, once again, not bouncing around from one punishment to another, which just teaches them they can outlast you. And lastly, words of encouragement before you feel like you're a failure as a parent. Isaiah 55:11, so is my word that goes out from my mouth. It will not return to me empty, but will accomplish what I desire and achieve the purpose for which I sent it. We have many times heard from disciple families and worked with their kids of recalcitrant teens who are just little monsters who end up getting thrown out of their house or quitting school or something. They go off and do drugs or have unprotected sex, and all this bad stuff happens. That years later they come back and they say they're prodigal son it. Mom, Dad, I was stupid, I was beaten up pretty badly, and I lost this and that. And they come back. The point is, the word doesn't come back void. Everything you've worked so hard to do to implant in their little hearts the word of God, they may say they reject it, but they can't get rid of it. It's in there. Too late, buddy. It's like a COVID vaccine. And many, many times we've heard from parents that, remember how terrible my kid was? He came back after 20 years. It might be 10 years. It might be 20 years. And sometimes I've predicted that and said, it might not be tomorrow. It might not be next year. But sometime this kid, I sense, has a good heart. He's going to be back to you. 2 Corinthians 10, the weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. As long as we stick to the Bible, we do as much as we can to obey it and treat our kids the way God treats us. Unconditional love, but limits, rewards, consequences. I think we're pretty well set. Now, last slide, and that's all, folks. I think we have time for maybe 5 minutes of questions, and yeah, okay. So